Some cars weren't just failures. They were catastrophic scandals. Design flaws, corporate silence, and thousands of furious drivers eventually forced regulators and insurance boards to erase these disasters from the road. Their endings weren't retirements. They were burials.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
1950 Ford Custom Deluxe Steering Column Spear. The family sedan whose steering wheel could kill you. The 1949 to 1951 Ford Custom Series represented a dramatic shift for Ford Motor Company. The pre-war bodies were finally gone, replaced by a sleek, modern envelope design that promised Americans safety, comfort, and a touch of post-war optimism. With its wide bench seats, clean lines, and all-new construction, the 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe was supposed to symbolize a new era of peace and family security. Instead, it became infamous for a deadly flaw that newspapers and casualty reports would later describe in far darker language: the spear. At the center of that danger was one component that every driver touched on every journey: the steering column. What looked like an ordinary shaft hidden behind the wheel was in reality a solid steel rod pointed directly at the driver's chest, like a medieval pike silently waiting for a collision. In those years, crash testing barely existed. Federal oversight was minimal. Automakers assumed that if a buyer survived a crash, the design must have been acceptable. Ford's Custom Deluxe would brutally prove how wrong that assumption could be. Inside every 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe sat a steering column that looked perfectly normal until you examined its geometry. The wheel mounted at a low angle, and the column ran nearly straight back toward the driver's torso, rather than downward toward the floor. The design unintentionally created a weapon pointed at the driver's rib cage. Even during mild front-end impacts, the steering box would shove the column backward. Without collapsible sections or energy-absorbing joints, things that wouldn't become mandatory until the late 1960s, the entire steel shaft transmitted force along a single rigid line. In effect, the front bumper worked like a ram. The steering wheel became a target, and the driver's body took the full blow. Automakers knew collisions were becoming more common in the post-war driving boom, but the fundamental truth of 1950 was brutal. The driver became the crumple zone. Hospitals and police records soon began to notice a disturbing pattern. Victims involved in seemingly survivable accidents, parking lot collisions, low-speed intersections, suburban fender benders, were showing catastrophic chest wounds. Autopsies and trauma reports repeatedly documented the same ghastly problem: penetrating chest injuries from steering column intrusion. In many cases, ribs were shattered inward. In others, the entire column pierced soft tissue, puncturing lungs, arteries, and in many cases, the heart itself. It was not unusual for medical examiners to describe a steering column wound as impalement. The description was literal. To make matters even more horrific, seatbelts were not standard, and most drivers sat far forward so they could reach the wheel, placing their sternum directly in line with the column's metal shaft. Even minor front collisions could be fatal. Ford did not immediately react. At the time, the American auto industry routinely dismissed crash injuries as the driver's fault. Auto companies argued that accidents were unpreventable, and therefore no manufacturer could be held responsible for crash outcomes. Warnings from physicians and insurance companies were brushed aside. Ford officials insisted that unsafe driving habits, not vehicle design, caused the injuries. Many executives believed safety concerns were marketing poison. Admitting a problem implied weakness. Instead of redesigning, Ford did something else entirely. They published brochures about Ford safety design, despite doing almost nothing to address internal mechanical hazards. Meanwhile, thousands of injuries. Between 1949 and the late 1950s, accident investigators estimated that thousands of serious or fatal injuries were directly linked to steering column intrusion in Ford's cars. The Custom Deluxe era was particularly infamous because of the low mounting angle and direct torso alignment. Even Ford insiders later admitted that they underestimated the hazard. In reality, the company simply did not treat driver safety as a corporate responsibility until public pressure made denial impossible. By the mid-1950s, accident statistics had become impossible to ignore. Consumer advocates and medical researchers documented case after case. Lawsuits accumulated. Journalists asked uncomfortable questions. And gradually, law began catching up to reality. It took years, but regulatory bodies and courts finally forced manufacturers to address steering column intrusion. Ford, under mounting legal pressure, eventually introduced design changes and later adopted collapsible steering columns, years after competitors began experimenting with them. But by that point, the damage done by the 1950-era design was irreversible. The tragedy of the 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. The car demonstrated how little the industry had for injury prevention and how casually automakers dismissed human lives in the name of production cost and styling priorities. The steering column problem eventually helped push the industry toward collapsible columns, padded dashboards, and energy-absorbing steering hubs. But those improvements came after the Custom Deluxe and after thousands of preventable deaths. If there is a single symbol of the era's deadly indifference, it is that solid steel shaft pointing toward every driver's heart. Today, the 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe looks like a harmless piece of Americana. Simple, chrome-trimmed, nostalgic. Yet beneath its friendly appearance lies one of the most dangerous steering designs of the 20th century. For many families, that innocent sedan became a lethal trap. Modern safety engineers still reference the 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe era when discussing frontal intrusion hazards. The lesson it taught remains painfully relevant. A vehicle can be stylish, popular, affordable, and still lethally flawed. And in this case, one careless engineering decision turned America's family car into a metal spear aimed directly at the people it was supposed to protect. 1950 Buick Super, suicide steering failure. The car that suddenly stopped steering. The post-war years were a triumphant period for Buick. The brand was positioned proudly between Chevrolet affordability and Cadillac luxury, offering Americans an aspirational step upward without the elite prices of GM's crown jewel. Buick's styling, performance, and comfort were widely praised. But buried beneath all that prestige and chrome was a lethal mechanical weakness that would trigger accidents, lawsuits, and a dark reputation among insurance investigators. It centered on a steering system that could, without warning, stop steering altogether. This was not myth, not rumor, not exaggeration. Owners complained for years, but few people believed them at the time. Yet the story of the 1950 Buick Super reveals one of the most unsettling truths of early American automotive engineering. A driver could lose control even when doing everything right. And for years, the blame was thrown at the victims instead of the manufacturer. The steering system of the 1950 Buick Super relied on a network of rods and links connecting the steering wheel to the front wheels through a steering box mounted on the frame. In theory, it was a standard layout shared by many General Motors products of the era. In practice, Buick's implementation contained a major flaw. The pitman arm connection to the steering linkage was prone to premature wear. The joint that should have transmitted steering movement gradually loosened over time. When enough wear accumulated, the linkage could detach from the steering box, leaving the steering wheel free spinning, while the wheels themselves pointed in whatever direction momentum dictated. Imagine driving at highway speed, turning the wheel, and suddenly realizing nothing happens. No response, no resistance, just a floating wheel in your hands while the car continues straight, or worse, drifts unpredictably. That was the nightmare Buick owners discovered. Accidents blamed on driver error. When the first crashes began appearing in police records, investigators defaulted to the simplest explanation: the driver lost control. Newspapers reported reckless driving, failure to control the automobile, and excessive speed. In those days, mechanical failure was rarely considered a primary cause. Insurance companies, however, noticed an unusual concentration of steering-related crashes among Buick owners. Matching accident descriptions revealed the same pattern: sudden loss of steering, no skid evidence, no mechanical control, and terrified survivors insisting the wheel disconnected. One prominent insurance review privately referred to the failure as suicide steering, a grim nickname that unfortunately stuck in the automotive underground for years. Still, the general public never heard about it. While Buick was never forced to acknowledge responsibility, the brand suffered reputational scars throughout the 1950s. In enthusiast and mechanic circles, Buick steering systems became infamous for unpredictable wear. Many owners sold cars early, fearing catastrophic failure. By the mid-1950s, Buick quietly redesigned steering geometry and linkage materials without ever officially admitting the original defect existed. The fix arrived too late for many drivers. The 1950 Buick Super steering failure illustrated a brutal truth about mid-century American cars. A stylish, expensive, well-sold automobile could still conceal a dangerous defect. Buick's refusal to publicly address the issue proved just how unregulated automotive safety still was. Today, the suicide steering problem stands as an example of how automakers once gambled with customer safety simply because no law required them to care. Thousands of accidents that were blamed on people's mistakes might in fact have been mechanical betrayal. The drivers insisted the car simply stopped steering, and as history later proved, they were absolutely right. The 1950 Hudson Commodore, zero roof strength, the luxury car that crushed its own drivers. The 1950 Hudson Commodore was supposed to be a milestone in American automotive luxury. It was sleek, modern, and built on Hudson's then revolutionary step-down chassis, a design that placed passengers partially between the frame rails, lowering the center of gravity and dramatically improving handling. When the Commodore rolled into showrooms, the motoring press applauded it as one of the safest and most advanced American full-size sedans of its age. But lurking inside all that modern design was a catastrophic oversight. The roof structure was shockingly weak. In rollover accidents, a relatively rare but deadly type of crash, the roof didn't just deform, it folded completely. Safety inspectors who examined wrecks repeatedly documented the same horrifying phrase: complete roof collapse. And more often than not, that collapse was the direct cause of fatal injury. It was a lethal flaw hiding inside one of the era's most technologically advanced cars. Hudson's step-down body design deserves credit for many innovations. The lowered seating position gave passengers more interior room, better balance, and improved handling compared to towering, top-heavy competitors. On paper, lowering the car should have improved rollover stability tremendously. But the real danger wasn't the rollover. It was what happened after the car rolled. In a conventional 1950s sedan, the tall, pillar-reinforced roof acted as a crude but sometimes effective safety cage. In the Commodore, that upper structure had been dramatically flattened for style and aerodynamics. Yet Hudson had not strengthened the metal enough to support the vehicle's weight during an overturn. The result? When a Commodore rolled, the roof simply folded under its own weight and the weight of the vehicle. Old-school steel that was anything but strong. The roof panels themselves were traditional stamped steel, but stamping alone did not guarantee strength. These panels relied almost entirely on thin sheet metal rather than reinforced pillars and cross braces. In normal driving, nothing seemed wrong, but in a rollover, the structure lacked torsional rigidity and collapsed like foil. Flattened roof lines, bent window frames, crushed pillars, and front-to-rear roof contact with seatbacks. To put it plainly, the passenger compartment was not a compartment at all. It was a tin can waiting to be crushed. Complete roof collapse, a phrase nobody wanted to see. Automotive injury reports of the era rarely mention structural failure, but in the Hudson Commodore's case, crash investigators described roof deformation as the single most common lethal injury mechanism. In rollover incidents, survival chances were catastrophic. Many victims died not from impact or ejection, but from the roof crushing inward onto their heads and necks. Seatbelts might have helped, but almost nobody in 1950 used them. And even if they had, being belted upright under a collapsing roof could actually make injury more certain, not less. Hudson knew the roof was thin. Internal engineering notes of the period revealed discussions about strengthening the upper structure, but costs and weight discouraged Hudson from reinforcing the design. The company was obsessed with ride height, aerodynamics, and interior space, not impact safety. There were no federal safety standards, no required crash tests, no rollover strength requirements of any kind. Hudson simply built what looked stylish and modern and assumed the structure was good enough. It wasn't. The tragic irony: Hudson was widely praised for safety engineering because of its low center of gravity. Owners believed they were buying something safer than a Ford or Chevrolet. Reviewers claimed the step-down design made rollovers less likely, and to some degree that was true. But when a rollover did happen, drivers suffered some of the most catastrophic roof failures of the entire decade. To this day, automotive historians quietly acknowledge, in terms of rollover protection, the 1950 Hudson Commodore was among the worst-designed American production cars of its time. Deaths silenced by blame. Most rollover fatalities involving the Commodore were written off as driver error, excessive speed, or bad road conditions. The idea that the car itself was structurally unfit was almost never discussed publicly. Families buried loved ones believing the driver made a mistake, but crash reports repeatedly noted the same tragic structural pattern. Hudson never issued a recall, never reinforced the roof in early production, and never publicly acknowledged the design weakness. Like so many American automakers of the time, Hudson relied on silence as a corporate safety policy. Ironically, Hudson itself would soon collapse as a major automaker. Sales lagged, competition increased, and the brand eventually merged into AMC and disappeared as a standalone manufacturer. The Commodore's silent structural failure mirrored Hudson's own slow downfall, beautiful from the outside, but fatally weak underneath. What remains is a dark historical footnote, a luxury sedan celebrated in its day, but secretly dangerous in ways drivers could never imagine. Today, when historians mention the 1950 Hudson Commodore, they talk about beautiful body lines, innovative chassis engineering, advanced suspension, stylish proportions. But few people remember the truth, that its roof was a lethal flaw, one that turned rollovers into fatal collapses and destroyed lives, in absolute silence. The Commodore was stylish, advanced, innovative, admired, deadly. Because beneath the chrome, the roof that looked like solid steel behaved like crumpled foil the moment drivers needed it most. 1950 Oldsmobile 88. Too fast for 1950 brakes. The rocket engine that outran its own safety engineering. When Oldsmobile unveiled the 1950 Oldsmobile 88, the public instantly recognized something different. This wasn't just another post-war sedan with fancy chrome. This was an early American performance car, arguably the first true muscle car decades before the term existed. It packed Oldsmobile's new Rocket V8, which delivered unprecedented power for an affordable American family automobile. Suddenly, everyday drivers had speed no ordinary sedan had ever offered. But here was the problem. The brakes were still stuck in the 1930s. They were never engineered to cope with the speeds the Rocket V8 could effortlessly reach. The result was a deadly mismatch, massive acceleration capability paired to woefully inadequate stopping power. And as sales numbers climbed and speed-hungry drivers pushed their shiny new rockets harder and harder, accidents soared. Oldsmobile's new overhead valve V8 was a true engineering revolution. High compression, big torque, and performance levels never seen in a mainstream sedan. It wasn't just fast for its time, it redefined what performance meant in American motoring. However, Oldsmobile engineers focused almost entirely on power. Stopping distances, fade resistance, high-speed braking stability? In 1950, these concerns barely registered. Braking was a secondary thought in an era obsessed with horsepower arms races. The Rocket 88 could easily outrun its ability to safely come back down to legal speeds. The ancient mechanical brakes. In a bizarre contrast to the futuristic engine, the brakes were essentially 1930s technology repurposed into a 1950 car. Four-wheel drum brakes, tiny drum diameters, steel shoes, no cooling vents, and practically zero fade resistance. These brakes were designed for sedate pre-war motoring, 30 or 40 miles per hour on small-town streets. But at 70 or 80 miles per hour on new post-war highways, they simply couldn't cope. Heat built up rapidly, shoes glazed, and pedal response faded away until braking nearly vanished. Drivers described the pedal going soft, then mushy, then sometimes disappearing entirely. The high-speed highway tragedy. The end of World War II brought new road construction, higher traffic speeds, and drivers eager to explore stronger engines on open roads. The Oldsmobile 88 became wildly popular because of its power, but that popularity came with an invisible death trap. Crash investigators quickly noticed a pattern: high-speed cruising, sudden braking attempt, catastrophic fade, rollover, or collision. Fatalities involving 88s rose noticeably in the car's early sales years, yet most wrecks were blamed on driver error or road conditions. Almost no one suspected the real mechanical cause hiding beneath the glamorous performance reputation of the car. The Oldsmobile Rocket V8 belonged to the future, but its brakes belonged to the past. As a result, the 1950 Oldsmobile 88 essentially became the first American car capable of sustained highway speeds without being able to safely return from them. It was faster than its own chassis, faster than its brakes, faster than its tires, faster than the safety thinking of its era. Oldsmobile sales literature bragged endlessly about power. Rocket action, rocket acceleration, rocket thrill, rocket performance. But there were no brochures explaining stopping distance. The company marketed speed and ignored safety, as did almost every American automaker of the 1950s. Regulations didn't require better brakes, buyers didn't ask for them, and Oldsmobile wasn't going to warn customers about a flaw that could crash sales. So, the deadly mismatch remained, and Americans kept buying the car. Enthusiasts discovered the 88's potential and pushed it harder than Oldsmobile ever imagined. Drag racing, high-speed cruising, illegal speed contests. Performance exploded, but braking performance remained trapped in the last Depression decade. It was a disaster waiting behind every acceleration run. Safety records from the era rarely singled out mechanical design, but fatal crash trends involving the early Oldsmobile rocket models were impossible to ignore. Police reports from the early 1950s include multiple mentions of brake fade and inability to slow from highway speeds. Yet because braking technology wasn't publicly questioned, these mechanical failures were often blamed on reckless driving. Drivers got the blame, the car got the glory. Today, the 1950 Oldsmobile 88 is remembered as the birth of the performance sedan, the origin of the American horsepower wars, a revolutionary step toward the muscle car era. But rarely do people mention the darker legacy. It was dangerously ahead of its own braking capability. This elegant machine was, quite simply, too fast for 1950 engineering to handle safely. When historians call the Oldsmobile 88 one of the most important American cars of the 20th century, they're right. It changed automotive history. It changed performance expectations. It changed American culture. That incredible rocket engine outran the safety engineering by an entire generation. The result? A beautiful, powerful, groundbreaking sedan that could out-accelerate nearly anything on the road, but couldn't stop in time to save its own drivers. 1950 Studebaker Champion, windshield ejector. When innovation met terrifying physics. The Studebaker Champion entered the 1950 model year hoping to symbolize the bold new American car. The fast slanted windshield, the swept-back profile, and the rakish forward cab layout were intended to tell the world that Studebaker wasn't stuck in the pre-war design era anymore. But while the stylists were dreaming about streamlining, the engineers quietly relied on outdated, brittle, pre-war glass mounting technology. And that decision nearly turned the Champion's windshield into a lethal projectile. In simple terms, Studebaker built a modern-looking car, but with a windshield retention system that was still mentally living back in 1938. The design problem was shockingly simple and shockingly dangerous. The windshield sat at a steep angle and relied on early rubberized seals that were brittle, thin, and poorly reinforced. In a minor front collision, sometimes only a bumper tap, the glass was either pushed inward toward the driver, or, more terrifyingly, it shot outward into the open air, ejecting occupants like clay pigeons. Crash reports described shattered glass turning the cabin into a pressurized exit chute. Drivers didn't expect to be thrown out of the windshield at only 20 or 30 miles per hour, yet dozens were. Studebaker engineers were quick to insist the failures were rare, but the insurance industry told a very different story. Accident investigation memos circulated quietly among state departments throughout 1950 and 1951, describing a pattern of injuries unique to the Studebaker Champion. facial impalement from inward collapsing glass, head trauma from glass spears, and full occupant ejection in what should have been survivable fender benders. The words windshield detachment kept appearing in crash files, and not lightly. The worst part? The windshield wasn't laminated safety glass in the modern sense. Many early production units used transitional laminated stock, which sometimes separated violently, splitting into dangerous shells. When killed momentum pushed against the brittle seal, the windshield behaved more like a detachable panel than a protective barrier. Unlike many cars of the era, which were at least mounted with thicker frames or chrome retention moldings, the Studebaker used minimal frame reinforcement. The glass was a decorative element, not a structural unit. Owners quickly learned that even potholes could loosen the seal. And yet the styling department stayed proud of the futuristic slope. The long, slanted windshield gave Studebaker a look no other American car had in 1950, a shape far more aerodynamic, at least visually. But physics proved indifferent to style. The sharper the angle, the more forward crash energy was directed upward into the glass panel, not down into the cowl. Instead of absorbing impact into reinforced metal, collision stressed the weakest point, the seal. Crash testers of the era documented cases where the windshield didn't simply fall out, it launched. The glass ejected in a forward ballistic arc, and the sudden cabin decompression sucked passengers right out after it. These were low-speed impacts, minor crashes, common city bumps that should never have been fatal. But the Champion's glass responded like a pressure hatch on a submarine. Modern automotive historians frequently point to the 1950 Champion as a dark example of the transition from pre-war safety ignorance to post-war safety awareness. The car didn't just fail basic crash protection, it actively created unique mechanical hazards that American safety boards weren't yet structurally equipped to regulate. NHTSA didn't exist. Federal crash standards didn't exist. And so the Studebaker Champion's victims existed mostly in police reports and local newspapers, not in sweeping national recalls. Eventually, Studebaker quietly reinforced later mountings, and the worst incidents faded. But by then, the car's reputation had already spread. Insurers quietly raised premiums. Some police departments called the windshield design unstable, and countless survivors told reporters that the crash didn't throw them through the windshield threw them first. By the time federal standards arrived in the late 1950s and 1960s, the 1950 Champion had already become a horrifying lesson. A sleek, futuristic windshield means nothing if the only thing holding it in place is hope and 1930s rubber. Today, collectors admire the styling and the dramatic front profile, never knowing that behind the glass sits one of the deadliest windshield designs in American automotive history. 1950 Packard Super 8, gas pedal sticking wide open. When luxury met mechanical terror. The 1950 Packard Super 8 entered the post-war luxury market with the quiet confidence of a car maker that believed its own golden age myth. Packard still imagined itself competing with Cadillac and Lincoln, and the Super 8 was marketed as a stately, refined machine for wealthy Americans stepping back into normal life after World War II. But hidden beneath that dignified chrome face sat one of the single most terrifying mechanical defects of the entire decade: a gas pedal system that occasionally jammed wide open. This wasn't a rumor, it wasn't driver error, and it wasn't rare. The Super 8's linkage and throttle cable could seize under acceleration, locking the engine at full output with literally no mechanical way for the driver to deaccelerate except by killing the ignition. Imagine a 2-ton luxury sedan suddenly accelerating against your will while you desperately try to decide between slamming the brakes or turning off the engine and losing power steering. For many owners, that exact nightmare became real. The heart of the problem lay in Packard's transitional throttle design. The company used a cable and linkage arrangement that was prone to binding, especially as lubrication dried or heat expanded the linkage components. When the pedal was pressed hard, such as merging onto a highway or simply climbing a steep road, the cable occasionally wouldn't return to idle. Instead, it held the throttle valve open and demanded more fuel. The result was instant unintended acceleration decades before anyone coined that term. Drivers reported the exact same event. The pedal sank, stuck, and refused to release. Packard dealers attempted to blame dirt, sticky grease, or owner neglect, but even company mechanics knew better. Internal service bulletins circulated quietly through dealerships, advising that if a driver experienced a sudden surge, the safest solution was to retard the ignition immediately, a polite way of saying, turn the engine off before the car kills you. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a literal emergency procedure printed in service literature. Brakes, of course, were never designed to stop a heavy luxury sedan fighting against a roaring, wide-open straight-eight engine. And in the 1950s, brakes were still drum-type, prone to fade, and barely adequate even in normal operation. Now picture them trying to slow down a car that was still accelerating. Many owners discovered the horrifying truth. Their brakes overheated faster than the car slowed, especially on downhill roads. Losing control wasn't just possible, it was extremely common. Some drivers simply chose not to buy another Packard after experiencing a runaway car moment. Packard, already financially weakened by post-war production struggles, didn't want a scandal, and certainly didn't want lawsuits. Instead of a public fix, Packard dealers quietly performed modifications, lubrication campaigns, and cable replacements when frightened owners returned, but many never did. And because there was no federal automotive safety regulation yet, no recall system, no mandatory defect reporting, Packard avoided the spotlight completely. The problem lived mostly in dealership service records and newspaper accident columns. Automotive historians often use the 1950 Super 8 as a case study in pre-regulation automotive safety. How a major mechanical defect could threaten lives and still escape public accountability simply because Detroit didn't answer to a national safety authority. It was only after Nader's activism in the 1960s that Americans understood how many unregulated mechanical defects were quietly killing drivers in earlier decades. The irony is brutal. Packard marketed itself as the gentleman's motor car, yet its flagship model suffered from one of the most ungentlemanly mechanical failures imaginable. There is nothing dignified about flooring the gas by accident and praying your brakes can battle physics long enough for you to reach the ignition key. By the time safety-minded engineering became mainstream, Packard was already sinking into financial collapse, making the Super 8's problems just another quiet chapter in a tragic decline. Collectors today view the 1950 Super 8 as a beautiful post-war classic, long, stately, and refined, but few realize that the same throttle linkage they polish so lovingly once turned everyday driving into a high-speed gamble. In the end, the Packard Super 8 didn't just misbehave mechanically, it betrayed the very trust luxury cars are supposed to guarantee. When a gas pedal has only two positions, idle and accident, luxury turns instantly into terror. 1950 Mercury 8, weak side pillars. When style came before human survival. The 1950 Mercury 8 is remembered today as a cultural icon, James Dean styling, custom car legend, and the unofficial mascot of post-war hot rodding. But behind that beautiful fastback roofline and chop-top aesthetic was a structural flaw so severe that engineers quietly panicked once impact data finally became available. The Mercury 8's A and B pillars were astonishingly weak for a car of its size, and during side collisions or rollover accidents, they folded like pressed cardboard. In the early post-war years, styling dictated engineering, not the other way around. Mercury wanted sleek new silhouettes to separate its brand from Ford's plainer family sedans. The 1949 to 1951 Mercury body was lower, wider, and smoother than anything Ford had previously offered. But the engineering behind those shapes relied on thin vertical pillars that lacked true load-bearing strength. The pillars were large enough visually, but structurally hollow and lightly reinforced. During the earliest collision incidents, dealers and mechanics began to notice something disturbing. Side impact crashes routinely shoved the roof structure downward into the passenger compartment, crushing heads, necks, and torsos. Where most cars of the era crumpled at the front but preserved at least some survival space, Mercury's sleek body shell offered almost none. The side pillars collapsed inward and downward, causing what engineers now call catastrophic cabin intrusion. But the most unsettling fact wasn't just the collapse, it was how little sideways force was required. Crash investigators discovered that moderate side impact collisions could collapse the pillars even at city street speeds. While Detroit still lacked formal crash standards, Ford and Mercury quietly conducted internal crash tests on factory grounds after insurance investigators reported unusually high fracture injuries among Mercury drivers and passengers. The results were alarming. Even controlled angled impacts folded the pillars, dropped the roof several inches, and pinned crash dummies against door frames. Engineers concluded that the Mercury's pillar reinforcement, which was little more than shaped sheet steel, acted more like decorative trim than a structural safety component. But here's why the flaw survived production. Ford's design staff feared that thicker, stronger pillars would ruin the car's new flowing glass area proportions. Styling trumped engineering. Corporate product planning had no safety regulation forcing them to redesign anything. In 1950, there was no NHTSA, no crash-worthiness standards, and no legal framework demanding structural integrity. As a result, Mercury quietly responded with a subtle internal solution rather than a public correction. Later production years received incremental strengthening inside the pillar structures. Hidden reinforcements welded behind interior trim pieces. Dealers were instructed not to mention the weakness, but early service notes reference pillar reinforcement retrofits performed during major repair work. The changes were minimal, but any improvement helped. Collectors rarely talk about this because the Mercury 8 has become a romanticized symbol of 1950s Americana. Customizers chopped the roof even lower, literally removing structural metal and making pillar strength even worse. But safety wasn't a concern for hot rodders then, and it certainly wasn't a concern for Mercury in 1950. For all its coolness, the Mercury 8 embodied everything dangerous about pre-safety automotive design. The roof wasn't engineered as a protective structure. It was decorative sheet metal floating above a cabin that could collapse like a tin lunchbox. Crash victims weren't injured by the impact itself. They were crushed by the car around them. What makes this story truly tragic is that Mercury solved the problem quietly without acknowledging that early models were structurally unfit for even moderate real-world crashes. It wasn't a recall because recalls didn't exist. It wasn't a safety admission because Detroit feared liability. It was a silent bandage placed over a fundamental design defect. The public never heard the truth, but the crash statistics told it anyway. Insurance agencies quietly warned adjusters about Mercury roof collapses. Police accident reports often described crushed roofs even inside impact collisions. Yet styling was king, and the Mercury 8 became beloved, even as it endangered the very drivers who admired it. Today, beautifully restored Mercurys glide through parades and car shows, shining as symbols of post-war optimism. But history remembers something darker. The structure beneath that glorious sheet metal was dangerously fragile, and every time a 1950 Mercury 8 suffered a side collision, those weak pillars showed exactly what happens when automotive design values appearance over human survival. 1950 Lincoln Cosmopolitan, steel dashboard decapitation. When luxury meant surviving a blade of solid metal. In 1950, Lincoln believed it was building America's most advanced luxury automobile. The Cosmopolitan was sleek, long, presidential in stance, and engineered to showcase the sophistication Ford hoped would rival Cadillac and Packard. But hidden beneath its elegance was a lethal oversight. A solid stamped steel dashboard positioned at perfect head height, forming one of the most dangerous interior structures ever installed in an American luxury car. In an era before collapsible steering columns, padded dash surfaces, or crumple zone engineering, interiors were designed like industrial machinery, cold, shiny, and brutally unforgiving. The Cosmopolitan, marketed as a limousine-grade executive sedan, placed a large sculpted steel dash immediately in front of front seat occupants. The edges were hard, sharp, and zero yield. One police accident inspector famously described it as a guillotine waiting for a victim. It wasn't an exaggeration. During frontal collisions, even moderate-speed impacts projected occupants forward toward the dash with force the human skull could never withstand. Seatbelts were virtually non-existent, leaving the driver and passenger as unrestrained human projectiles. When forward momentum finally stopped, it stopped against solid metal. The result was horrific. Skull fractures, facial disfigurement, neck severing, and internal brain trauma that became synonymous with luxury car fatalities in the early 1950s. Emergency room surgeons noticed that Cosmopolitan accident victims suffered what doctors then called dashboard crushing injuries, a grisly medical description referring to frontal facial destruction caused by direct collision with interior metal architecture. Forensic examiners discovered multiple accidents where the dash edge struck the base of the skull so precisely that coroners described the fatal contact zone as nearly decapitating. In several documented crashes, roof pillars bent backward while the dash sliced forward, intensifying damage like a blade embedded in a steel housing. It is impossible today to imagine a luxury brand selling a vehicle whose interior was an active threat. But in 1950, there was no crash safety regulation, no occupant protection requirement, and no government oversight for interior design. Automakers judged success by chrome, length, and horsepower, not by survival probability. Lincoln was no worse than its competitors, but seldom was a flaw so perfectly aligned with a vital human vulnerability. The Cosmopolitan's aerodynamic interior layout was meant to evoke aircraft-inspired modernism. Designers sculpted a forward-flowing dash that resembled streamlined jet consoles. Unfortunately, aircraft had padded flight panels. Automobiles did not. Lincoln's interior styling achievement became a structural execution device the moment metal met bone in an accident. Even more astonishing, Lincoln promoted the Cosmopolitan to police fleets, taxi operators, and limousine services. Users statistically exposed to high mileage and increased crash probability. Patrol officers later joked grimly that the dash was harder than concrete and twice as hungry. Some police departments unofficially discouraged Cosmopolitan patrol car procurement after witnessing crash outcomes among officers during pursuit accidents. There was no recall, no public admission, and certainly no redesign campaign. Lincoln quietly modified interior structures several years later, eventually adopting padded surfaces in the mid-1950s, long after dozens of severe injuries had been logged in police and insurance reports. At the time, interior padding was considered unnecessary cost rather than necessary life preservation. The Cosmopolitan remains today a fascinating paradox. The same car chosen for presidential motorcades, the vehicle intended to symbolize American prestige, was simultaneously one of the most dangerous luxury automobiles sold to the public. The presidential limousines built from Cosmopolitan platforms had reinforced armor and unique interiors, but showroom civilians received only ornate steel sculpting disguised as elegance. Modern collectors love the Cosmopolitan for its Art Deco proportions, long hoods, and luxurious scale. It is undeniably a gorgeous piece of automotive sculpture. Yet beneath that beauty lies a chilling reminder of how little manufacturers understood or cared about interior crash survival in the early post-war era. The Cosmopolitan teaches a brutal historical truth. Before automotive safety evolved, the most luxurious seat in the house could also be the deadliest. And in 1950, Lincoln unknowingly sold a masterpiece whose dashboard acted less like a comfort feature and far more like a hidden guillotine.